Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We will be getting started in just a minute here. We are still letting lots of folks in, so thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. You've come to the right place. We will get started in just a moment. We are still getting a lot of folks joining, so bear with us for just a moment and we will get started momentarily. All right. In the interest of time, we are going to go ahead and get started, and folks will continue to stream in here as we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our friends joining us bright and early from the West Coast. We are so glad that you've joined us for this installment of the Joyce Foundation's Lunch and Learn webinar series entitled Funding Safety, Crises and Opportunities for Violence Prevention Efforts. My name is Luisa Aviles. I'm a Senior Program Officer in the Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program, and I'm so delighted to be joined today by John Mackey, who is a fellow at the New York University Marin Institute of Urban Management and formerly the director of our own Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, and Heather Warnken, the founding executive director of the Center for Criminal Justice Reform at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Before we get started, a little bit of quick housekeeping. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and in the coming days will be made available on the Joyce Foundation's website. Second, we expect to have at least 20 minutes for question and answer, and we encourage you to drop questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen as they come to you, even if the presenters are still talking. That way we will not interrupt their flow, but we'll be able to have your questions ready when we get to the Q&A section. Thank you to everyone who shared questions when you registered. We've had a chance to review those, and we'll get to as many as we can in the course of the presentation. Finally, after today's discussion, we will share the key materials referenced in the webinar. And before I hand things over to the presenters, I want to take just a minute and share a little bit of background to make sure we're all starting from the same place. So community violence intervention, or CVI, aims to reduce particularly gun violence by preventing and disrupting cycles of retaliation and by delivering supports and services to save lives, address trauma, and provide opportunity and improve the conditions that drive violence. Since 2020, local, state, and federal governments have made unprecedented investments in CVI as a component of a shifting public safety landscape, which has raised a lot of questions about how cities should balance CVI work alongside policing and other longstanding public safety institutions. And all of this money feels very new, but John and Heather have done a lot of research and analysis to understand the history of government grant making around violence and safety, and to develop some lessons learned and recommendations around what advocates and practitioners have needed to do in order to successfully sustain and reform that funding so it's actually usable in the long term for the work on the ground. So with that, I will turn it over to John.
All right. Hi, everyone. Everyone can see me? Let me share my screen, and please, I once did one of these presentations where I had I thought I was sharing it and I wasn't. So let me know. Let's see here, view.
I think you're looking for view and then slideshow.
Thank you.
There you go.
All right, there we go. All right, all good? All right, hello everyone. As Lisa said, my name is John Mackey. I am a fellow at the NYU Merit Institute. Just a quick plug for this place if you aren't familiar with it. This is a kind of an action kind of do think tank. Does research in all kinds of urban affairs issues, from safety and justice to transportation. If you don't know about Marin, check it out. I'm biased, but I think it's a phenomenal place. Quick overview of today's presentation. We're going to talk about two reports that Joyce has funded. I'll be talking about a report that came out earlier this year called Crises and Opportunities for CVI. This is really a kind of a framework report about what we can learn about how to improve federal, state, and local grant making from the history of particularly public safety grant making, but federal grant making in general. And then my colleague Heather will go into kind of a case study looking at a federal compensation program called the BOCUS Crime Victim Compensation Program. So let me begin. I guess I should have put this on here, and I thought it's really important. If you've come here hoping that I have, or we have this kind of secret pot of federal money that will solve all your problems. Fortunately, this is not the presentation we're going to be giving. But I do think my job here will be to kind of tell a story about how federal grant making works and how government grant making works. This is something that you're all probably in. Hopefully, I'll kind of tell the story in a way that will demystify you, make you feel empowered, which you are, and I think hopefully chart a path in the years to come. So I have to tell the story. I have two basic premises. One, as Louisa mentioned, I don't think this one is controversial, that community violence intervention, or CVI, has never been as prominent as it is today. And the second one, which I'm particularly interested in, is that there's never been the kind of level of awareness, kind of practical know-how about federal grants, and particularly federal grants to state and local governments, their strengths and their weaknesses. So from these two premises, I want to argue today that the prominence of CVI, kind of the know-how around federal government grant making, is a kind of resource itself. And this is a term I've made up. It's policy capital. You all have policy capital right now. And that, I mean, I'll talk more about this in a moment. It's a form of political capital. You know, we've not really won elections, but we have power. That power is based on an administrative know-how, and in particular, the relationships you've likely cultivated across government and other nonprofits in your community, but also throughout the country. And I'm going to argue that this is capital that we should be spending down right now. We should spend this down to help sustain effective CVI programs, and relatedly strengthen state capacity to address future problems that are in the offing. And probably one of the most acute ones coming up is the imminent loss of the American Rescue Plan Act recovery funds. All right, let me just kind of go over the first premise, and a lot of this is probably pretty familiar, again, and uncontroversial, but I still kind of want to set the stage. So again, what we call community violence intervention has a very long history in the United States, and we kind of think of it as a new program, but some great scholarship, which I've cited to throughout the report, and they'll be in the slides. I'll come back to you. You'll have all these sources if you'd like to kind of follow up on them for yourself. But CVI, this kind of model CVI, has been around for a very long time in this country. It's been used to address lots of different kinds of problems, from immigration, juvenile delinquency, but it's kind of consistent in the sense that there's a use of outreach workers, workers who particularly have a direct experience, lived experience with the populations they're serving. Today, the prominence of CVI, and again, as Louisa opened up with, is undoubtedly connected to kind of the national, state, and local advocacy, but I think particularly the national level. And really, there's two kinds of actors I want to point to. There's amazing kind of advocacy that grew up around, groups like Invest in Us, Fund Peace. Those are the national players. Again, it's certainly at the local level. And then I think they were responsible for cultivating partnerships and often going to work in the Biden administration. So those two partners, those two actors, they use CVI to do a couple of things. One, of course, is to use CVI to respond to chronically high rates of gun violence. These are long-standing, concentrated in certain populations in low-income Black and Latino and Latino communities. And this is alongside of our overuse of incarceration and criminal justice mechanisms to respond to a crime and violence. But more acutely, alongside of this long-standing high rates of violence, was the response to the unprecedented spike in homicides that was associated with COVID-19 and the social and economic disruptions that it caused, which exacerbated all of these pre-existing disparities. So out of this really just incredible work, lots of stuff happened, and it's kind of hard. This is only a few years ago, but it's easy to forget maybe just how much was accomplished in the last 4 years. Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Community Act, and this is not a complete summary, but in this act of Congress, creating the Community Violence Prevention and Intervention Initiative, which allocated $250 million that could be used for CVI over the next 5 years. There was the first ever Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which was established by executive order in the White House. There was a long slew of administrative efforts to leverage existing grant programs, to provide technical assistance programs, to connect providers and researchers and program practitioners throughout the country. But I think without a doubt, the real kind of crowning achievement of this work was in the American Rescue Plan, state and local recovery funds. So the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, it was a $1.9 trillion COVID stimulus. Also a bit of a kind of a jumpstart to the infrastructure work the Biden administration did. But in this particular fund, they allocated $350 billion to all state and local governments throughout the country. This was an unprecedented infusion in many ways, the largest infusion of state and local governments ever in one single act by a long shot. And it was what was also somewhat unprecedented about it. It was, while it was dedicated to certain aspects of the pandemic, it also was looking to build what we can think of as what's often called state capacity. And state capacity is a term we use to describe the basic functions that we expect government to provide, safety, roads, bridges, basic services like that. So again, it had kind of two aspects, the pandemic, but also kind of a forward-looking state capacity, which includes, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, funding local nonprofit organizations. Now, so the bill itself was very, very broad, as these kinds of bills often are. But really it was the Department of the Treasury, and I just want to call them out because they just did phenomenal work. I'm doing research on them now, just extraordinary. And the Department of Treasury was the administrative agency that administered and granted these funds to state and local governments, and they made CBI in federal rule an official expenditure that state and local governments could, and also they in some ways recommended should be spending. So because of that work, 359 state and local governments, this is Treasury data to date, obligated a little more than over $1 billion in CBI. And it was research that Joyce has funded by Phil Rocco and Amanda Cass have documented. This number is a little bit misleading. CBI clearly became kind of a catch-all for lots of different kinds of expenditures. But even so, even though if that number is not quite as big as the 359 state and local governments or over $1 billion, there's still without a doubt the kind of prominence it had, the funding it had, the fact that we're talking about it today in these terms. CBI has never been more resourced or more visible. And then let me move to my second premise here, which is really about ARPA. That not only is CBI more prominent, but state and local federal grants to state and local governments, I think, are just, and this is just from work I've done across the country, people are aware of them in ways that they never have been before. Their strengths and their weaknesses. And I want to put this in some context, and here I'm going to kind of go into story mode. So again, lots of stuff are super unprecedented about the American Rescue Plan. But in some ways, what the American Rescue Plan did and the state and local recovery funds did is they strengthened capacities that were already there. Federal grants for several decades now have been one of, if not the primary way in which federal leaders not just support state and local governments, but try to influence domestic policy. So some recent data here, federal fiscal year 2022, Congress allocated a budget of $1.2 trillion, or almost 20% of the total spending to state and local grants. Federal grants make up around 30% of state budgets, and then that'll vary a bit more down the city and county level. But it's to say that federal grants to state and local governments have been, not just starting with ARPA, but before, a massive part of the federal government and the federal government's relationship to state and local governments. And I think what's important about this, and this is like for the advocacy that we all need to do, is to kind of think about this a bit historically. This system that we have today, and let's just call it the modern kind of federal grant system, is a real departure from most of American history. It was both, like I say on this top line here, a result and the cause of a kind of a transformation of American government. And this transformation is, first of all, it's characterized by an expansion of what we expect the state to do, an expansion of state capacity. We look to state, the government, federal level, state and local level, to solve problems that, certainly 100 years ago, we would never think about government solving. This transformation is rooted in the government's response, the federal government's response to the Great Depression, but really starts flexing around World War II, kind of the building up of the American military in World War II. War, by the way, as scholars have noted, has kind of been one of the I don't know, events. Crises have been events in which grant making changes. But if the New Deal, if the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s kind of planted these seeds, for us, who work in domestic issues, especially criminal justice, violence reduction, safety, this really began to blossom in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and the Nixon administration. And I say that because for the first time, the federal government really tried to reach into the state and local level to influence crime, violence, and safety. And there's a whole brand new focus there for federal government through grant making. I think importantly, this has grown. This is not a single party issue. This modern system of grant making has grown under both political parties, and it's grown substantially. So I want to lay out some of the history. There's some of the basic history. I want to lay out some of the features, and these features can often frustrate us because we think they come out of nowhere, but they're embedded in that history. So federal funding will almost always have these very broad and ambiguous mandates. And some of that has to do with Congress needing to pass legislation that can cover the entire country, the results of compromise. And there are other issues too, which I'll get to in a moment. But they'll have these kind of mandates like we had in the American Rescue Plan, respond to the public health emergency. You know, that could mean all kinds of things. And that's really, Congress didn't say much more about that. And really, the next level of that is the legislation then moves to the administrative agencies. And this grant-making system that we have today, they created a new kind of government worker. At the federal level, you see a lot more of them, but they're federal grant and contract managers. These are people who are not providing direct services like police officers, teachers, et cetera. They are administering money. And they're often, and this I think is really important to think about, this money is administered or the way this money kind of hits the ground, it's through proxies. So if Congress is allocating money, they are expecting the policy priorities to be implemented by government proxies at the state and local governmental level and the non-governmental level. So it's government doing things indirectly or through what one of the great scholars of American government calls interweaving federal government work with state and local government and nonprofits. This work requires, there's a mandate on top, but it's really about Congress and the federal government tries to influence how this money gets spent through rulemaking and procedure. And anyone who's dealt with federal grant making will kind of know and feel that. It's not terribly effective, and it also goes all the way down. So there's federal rules, and there's also state and local rules and policy and law, which I'll talk about at the end. This grant making also creates empowers third-party interest groups, including the proxies themselves, including people who receive federal grants. So two great examples of this are kind of victim advocates or victim service providers through programs like VOCA and VAWA, or law enforcement through programs like Burn Jag Assistance. So these are folks who are often receiving money, but they're interacting with Congress, they're interacting with governors or local state federal legislators who are interacting with Congress. And many times they will have more political influence than the administrators themselves. And this, this creates some problems, I guess, or maybe opportunities too. One is it creates a kind of implementation problem. So again, anyone who's worked in government or worked around the issues know implementation is a very difficult problem. And the reason it's a problem here is because the source of the money and the policy directive is kind of implemented through chains that the original Congress or the administrative level doesn't fully control, right? And so that creates all kinds of issues. One issue it creates is that government becomes kind of invisible. So again, I'm assuming on this call there are lots of people, for example, who probably received American Rescue Plan funds or government funds. But at the same time, probably don't think of themselves as government employees or government proxies. But if your funding comes from the federal government or the state government or local government, there's a way in which you are, in fact, an actor of the government. But when you're providing services, people probably aren't thinking that you're the federal government. They're thinking you're like a local nonprofit. So this creates kind of a problem of government visibility. But even though the government becomes invisible in this work, the government will typically get blamed for anything that goes wrong or anything that's often perceived to go wrong. So this is just, I'm noting this because this is something I think we need to work on. I think there's opportunities here, but this kind of problem, implementation, visibility, and trust, I think is often the result of real bad law and policy, where especially lawmakers will try to correct problems that they see or often misperceive. So this kind of gets me to the end of my presentation here. I think there's a real need to, based on the work that you've all done, that we've seen all done throughout the country, to rethink or really to think about federal government grant making. You know, when we think about government grant making, whether it's from the federal level, the state level, the local level, I think we often assume it's pretty simple. It's a matter of spending money. Often you hear about government grant making as just pass-throughs. And I think this is a horribly flawed conception of how grant making works. It totally misrepresents the complexity, the history, which I went through. But I think like most importantly, it underplays, or it covers up the opportunity for collaboration, for learning, for creativity. And that's really the kind of the recommendations that I wanted to think about, that government grant making could be an amazing opportunity for creative policy making. And this is what I wanted to throw in some terms here. This is what, again, the scholar Don Kettle calls leverage government, or what Jennifer Palka, another scholar of government, calls project versus product funding. And it's the idea of creating in government small teams of people who are able to work across government, in and through government, work with nonprofits, but in particular to learn, to not just implement, but to learn. And I strongly suspect throughout the country, state and local governments had to do that with the ARPA funds. There's probably these little teams. You know, if in your jurisdiction, if you received ARPA funds, it probably was because at some basic level there was a collaboration inside government to make these funds work. And I think this is a real opportunity to keep those collaborations alive. And this goes again to kind of my notion of policy capital. Right now, all across the country, there's this enormous amount, maybe unprecedented amount of policy capital. People know about, they've done work with this grant money. They know how it works. They know how the administrative aspects of it work, or at least parts of it. And they have relationships. And this is probably the most important thing. They have relationships throughout government, throughout nonprofits. And this kind of, and it's power. I want you all to think about this as power and resources. This is a kind of power that it's ripe. It's ripe right now, but it will decay very fast. In fact, this is a presentation that I probably could have given like a year ago. All the knowledge we have right now, people will forget about this. People will leave their jobs. So I think right now in particular, there's a real importance to kind of seize this political capital, this policy capital, to try to reform government grant making. One, because this is important in itself. This is one of the major ways we do government. But two, we have these big problems coming up. We have the end of the ARPA funds, you know, this kind of what's often referred to as a COVID fiscal cliff. And all the federal programs that I mentioned, these are programs that are at risk of going away. There's programs in statute that will last a little bit longer, but anything that the Biden administration did could be wiped away with the next administration. So here's some basic recommendations. I would recommend to, you know, at every state level, local level, government community leaders should look to ways to, one, you know, assess the programs that have been federally funded, that have supported CVI, but in particular to look at the ways in which your state government, local laws and policies mediate or structure federal grants. You know, the federal law and policies is pretty hard to change. A lot of the state and local law and policy, it responds to what's in federal law and policy, but it does other things to it. And that body of law and policy is far more elastic than we often realize. And then through this work together is finding ways to support and enhance the program outcomes that have been achieved, in particular through the ARPA funds. I want to note here, you know, this work it's good if we could fund this sort of assessment. So I would look at is the clock is really ticking on the ARPA funds, but ARPA funds could be used for, you know, for this. So in your jurisdiction, that's one place to look. General revenue is one place. The federal grant, the Burn Justice Assistance Grant, philanthropic support. I would say this is work that doesn't really require money, but I think money kind of helps raise the profile of it. So look for it there. And then lastly, though, this is my my very last slide. I want to recommend that this work should really try to focus on what has worked in the history of government grant making. I think when we think about government grant making, we tend to think about it like it's a blank slate that we can kind of just imagine how it works. And that you're only going to be frustrated if that's your approach to government grant making. Government grant making, as I've argued, it comes out of a history. It's structured in a certain way, and it can frustrate you if you don't know this history, but you can use that history to your advantage. And I think one place we should look to is the role of victim service coalitions, which I think are a great parallel for CVI. Victim service coalitions essentially invented victim services. They invented, established federal funding for it. That's why we have an Office of Victims of Crime within the Department of Justice. So I think that's a great parallel. I would also advocate to a lot of these types of initiatives, you'll go to legislators, governors, God love them, but this is work where the knowledge is really based at the experience, the administration of the grants themselves, the grant funding program. So draw from that. That's where the policy capital really lies. And then my very last point here, as I said earlier, is to really focus on the state and local law policy and practice. One, because we're going to have far more control of that. And then two, it probably goes without saying, we live in very uncertain and precarious times, and it's difficult and hard to be thinking about the good we can get from government right now. But I think we need to remember that at the federal level, whatever happens, our system of government, our system of American federalism places a lot of power at the state and local level. And so that's where we can, no matter what happens at the federal level, that's where we can remain strong. And hopefully there's work across the country that we've done in the last 4 years that we can find inspiration in and carry us forward. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Heather.
Thank you, John. I will just dive right in. And John, thank you for advancing the slides for me. So I'm going to start with an overview of this part 2, which, as John mentioned, will be sort of a case study of some of the big ideas and concepts that he has already laid out. So for the most part, I'm going to be digging into the key analysis and recommendations from our recent policy brief together, realizing the promise of crime victim compensation, recommendations for community violence intervention to meet the needs of underserved victims. Given our focus today of really being able to leverage federal funding, I'm going to start with making sure we're clear on the nuts and bolts of the role of VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, because this area is so confusing. And that's one of the reasons why we have this sort of underutilized potential of funding through crime victim compensation. And then overall, I seek to highlight the opportunity of improving access to this program for funding, scaling, and sustaining safety, especially in more innovative and equitable ways, especially for survivors who have been bearing the brunt of violence and have been least likely to be seen and served as victims of crime through these programs. Next slide. So starting with the foundation of what is crime victim compensation. So the really important landmark legislation, the Victims of Crime Act of 1984, through that Congress established government funding for victim services and created the Crime Victims Fund to really accomplish this in 2 different ways. And so the CVF collects deposits from federal fines and fees to address the needs of victims. One, through the VOCA Victim Compensation Grant Program. So this provides states with funding to support direct reimbursement to individuals for the costs of certain expenses that they incur as a result of being a victim of crime. This gets confused often with the VOCA Victim Assistance Grant Program. This, on the other hand, provides states with funding to support grant making to programs through government agencies, programs through government or community-based organizations that are providing direct services to victims. It's important to really be able to differentiate because some of the fine print about eligibility restrictions, et cetera, that may be only attached to one, sometimes get attributed to the other, creating confusion and creating barriers to access. But one theme that is consistent across both of these is the incredible amount of discretion that state and local jurisdictions have with how they implement these programs. So the federal government is playing an important role, but you then have this flexibility and creativity, but also this kind of justice by geography that happens state by state, depending on how they use their discretion. Next. So as we've established, victim compensation is one of the nation's dedicated sources for meeting the needs of crime victims. So these expenses, and we'll talk more specifically about the different examples of this, but in general, we're talking about medical and mental health needs, funeral and burial. These expenses are not borne equally. So as many on this webinar know, a large body of evidence demonstrates the profound racial and socioeconomic disparities in risk of violent victimization and its impacts, with low-income communities of color bearing the brunt of these costs. So I'm going to go through a few of the different categories of the tremendous promise and potential for crime victim compensation, both in not just meeting the needs of communities impacted by violence, but in addressing the longstanding inequities and complex barriers and challenges that this program can serve. So number one, to emphasize, this is by its very design intended to help the most vulnerable victims in society. Victim compensation is a payer of last resort. So this government program is supposed to kick in when the person has no other way of meeting these needs, through health insurance, for example, if in the case of physical injury. We also know that left untreated, the trauma from violent victimization can have cascading impacts in people's lives. So loss of employment, stable housing, it can exacerbate substance use challenges and untreated mental health challenges, over-reliance on emergency rooms, and as well as fueling cycles of involvement in the criminal legal system. So crime victim compensation can help leverage federal funds to prevent these problems, thereby helping to reduce the state and local costs of violence. For these reasons, CVI has been an underutilized tool in the CVI ecosystem, especially given the potential that it has for engaging and supporting those who are at the very highest risk of being victims of violence or perpetrating harm. So again, and as John and I lay out in our brief, really the research case behind this, that in communities where violence is concentrated, the impact of trauma combines with chronic disinvestment, lack of support services, and a longstanding over-reliance on police, prosecution, prison, and jail. So these conditions break down social trust, they breed cynicism toward government. Crime victim compensation gives government agencies a different way to respond to victimization outside of the criminal legal framework of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. And so in doing so, part of the potential I want to lift up here is they provide an opportunity for government agencies and community-based organizations to work together, to build trusting relationships needed to not just interrupt cycles of violence, but to solve crime. You know, we have a crisis of clearance and solve rates throughout the country, and these challenges that we are trying to lift up in this brief and the potential of supportive community service and healing approach that a government agency can play can not just fill in those gaps in resources, but rebuild these trusting relationships. So in other words, this isn't just about the healing and dignity of victims. This is about public safety, and this is about making the case of the return on investment for improving these programs. Next. So we've established the potential to meet the needs of survivors and promote systemic legitimacy, and yet compensation across the country has remained inaccessible to the majority of crime victims, especially those most in need. So a growing body of research has demonstrated that Black and Brown victims, in particular, those living in low-income communities, are least likely to be seen and served as crime victims. And for those who are interested in more information on this, happy to send you a number of reports speaking to this, that despite these higher rates of violent victimization, compensation programs notoriously disproportionately deny and alienate applicants of color. And this has been especially true for Black men and youth impacted by gun violence and other forms of community violence. So there are a range of problems that undermine program effectiveness. And in our brief time together, I'm just going to hit a couple of the main areas of this. One, unreasonable attempts to promote victim, quote, cooperation and reporting to police. Now, this is especially unjust, of course, for victims who may fear or distrust police, or who may have a prior arrest or conviction record. Relatedly, blaming the victim. These programs in so many jurisdictions operate on a flawed model of only supporting, quote, innocent victims, which leads to subjective determinations of worthiness that are too often influenced by the applicant's race, zip code, prior criminal legal system involvement, or other discriminatory factors. Also, this paradoxical reliance on a reimbursement model. So we've already established that the program is meant to be for those who have no other way to cover these costs. And yet the program functions by asking people to pay for the costs up front and then get reimbursed. It does not work for so many people. They go into debt. They can't utilize the program effectively. Next slide. Another huge area that I hope we can continue to talk more about across the country, the diminishing and unjust reliance on state and local criminal legal system fines and fees to pay for these benefits. So this has been problematic in many places. One, it has put crime victim compensation reform on a collision course with criminal justice reform that with diminished debt burden from fines and fees that has put certain programs in the red. It's been an unstable funding source, but I think most significantly, it has created this regressive and unjust taxation system where essentially we are footing the bill for these programs on the backs of poor individuals who have been, in some cases, over-criminalized, experience over policing in their communities, maybe have cycled in and out of the system and have carried a heavy debt burden based on those fines and fees. And yet those are the same exact individuals that have disproportionately been denied victim compensation when they become a victim of crime. So the states that have started to use general revenue funds instead of relying on these fines and fees, this is a really important trend that other states need to follow. And then lastly, just programs needing a better understanding of the resources and capacities that they don't have to meet the needs of their victim population. And for so long, CVI in particular, the experts on the front lines of that work have not been at the table on victim service needs assessment, VOCA funding, and needed changes to the crime victim compensation program. So I think there's an incredible opportunity to change that, to diversify that table, and it directly relates to better utilization of federal funds. Next slide. So I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for Q&A. So I am going to briefly kind of go through the recommendations and action steps portion of our brief, but we're happy to have offline conversations or go deeper on any pieces of this. And I will say, just as an overview, we did this section in both recommendations and then hands-on action steps to operationalize them. We also wrote this very broadly and very flexibly to speak to community violence intervention organizations, a diverse array of government partners, and other victim service and community-based stakeholders to work together in coalition. They're drafted to be flexible to fit these really unique state and local contexts, given how much these dynamics and programs can differ across the country. So it's very much meant to be flexible, to meet you where you are in your state. And it's also, I hope, at this point, which has even changed from the time we published this brief until now, got some amazing case studies within the case study of how this is working across the country. This report was really a blueprint for the success that we had this past session in Maryland, passing an overhaul of the crime victim compensation in this state. So happy to share more about those lessons learned. And hopefully, one of the takeaways that I hope you will have from this webinar is how much we should be working together across the country to learn from some of the successes and setbacks that we've experienced in states that have been on the forefront of this work. Next. So first, grounding these reforms in an understanding of what the state and federal requirements actually are. Again, there's a lot of misconception. And one of the things that's so critical about making sure that there's deep understanding and rooting of program changes in the federal law is to make sure that that state can continue to work with the federal government and be eligible for this 75% matching funds that the federal government provides to states the following year. So really incentivizing the state level to maximize that federal contribution. Next slide. So an example of this that's especially important in the community violence intervention space is the longstanding confusion and controversy on the role of cooperation. And I use that in air quotes because this has really been a very challenging and very counterproductive aspect of victim compensation programs, because the way that it is designed to sort of coerce victims and survivors into participating in a criminal justice investigation in ways that have backfired, that have ultimately alienated vulnerable victims and survivors from accessing that government support. And the role that police in particular, and sometimes prosecutors, have played in trying to use this as a carrot or a coercive tool to help bring someone into an investigation, that tying that to these benefits. In 2021, the VOCA Fix Act at the federal level clarified across the country that this was never intended to coerce or require a victim to participate in a criminal investigation to access these benefits. And it made that clear with this new updated language that really shows and demonstrates that. And part of why this is so important is that for so long, we've been getting it backwards, that actually it has not been pragmatic for victims to want to participate in a system that didn't have the tools to keep them safe, both physically or emotionally, and that by taking a health and healing oriented approach to crime victim compensation to assist people with the destabilizing expenses and challenges that they experience in their worst moments after the trauma of violent victimization, we actually create the type of support that makes it more likely for them to collaborate with government systems, including participating in a criminal investigation. Next. Similarly, really digging in to understand the role that state law and practice plays with these federal requirements. Where are the areas in your state where the state law has gone further and been more restrictive or more alienating in ways that the federal government did not require? Are there opportunities to fund expenses beyond the federal requirements that are huge unmet needs in your jurisdiction, such as emergency awards for funeral and burial, crime scene cleanup? And what are the unique processes in your state about navigating the program? How are people notified of these decisions? Are there ways to apply online? Is the appeal process feasible? You know, in a lot of places, you might need an attorney or an ability to really understand the court system in order to challenge an unjust denial of victim compensation benefits, which just is going to be a complete non-starter, especially for those who could seek to benefit from the program the most. Next. Building coalition across government and non-governmental partners. We have a whole section of our brief that really takes an inventory of who these key players are. And again, I will emphasize the fact that those in CVI who, given sort of the hierarchy of harm in this country and the false binary that so many systems operate under around who are victims and survivors versus who are people involved in the criminal legal system, has really alienated some of the most important partners and experts in this work from the table. So community violence intervention, trauma recovery centers, offices of violence prevention at the local and state level. These are incredible opportunities for leadership and collaboration with these entities. Next. Same goes for establishing, I think we're back one slide. Same goes for establishing the partnerships with non-governmental agencies, including TRCs, hospital-based violence intervention programs, and others in the CVI ecosystem. Hospitals and mental health providers play a critical role in making these programs more effective. Funeral homes, and we have a whole section in our report digging further into that. Next. And perhaps the most important one of all, this is actually for recommendation 3, is the state administering agencies, the community, the crime victim compensation program administrators who are critical to this. And we highly recommend meeting with early and often in any attempt for reform. And then lastly, this recommendation 4, exploring where are the areas of greatest impact in your jurisdiction to improve these programs, and really being able to differentiate where you need to potentially go for a state law change or what you could change administratively by working with your state program, and that do not require going to your legislature. And with that, if you just advance one more, I will close out with just a couple of important takeaways. If you go back one, again, to highlight the transformative win that we had in Maryland this year that you can see changed so many of the pieces of this that we just covered. And one of the significant pieces of this that was only possible by working across such a diverse government and community-based coalition of stakeholders was to truly overhaul this program based on the research and with a completely different lens, which was a different strategy than sort of some of the piecemeal reforms that have taken place in recent years. And then lastly, and I'll close out and we'll get to the Q&A section, a number of amazing reports, including a couple of recent ones from the Alliance for Safety and Justice, have cataloged some of the other success stories across the country. There's a really exciting project underway right now out of the Center for American Progress and Common Justice, doing a state review that's meant to be a tool for those across the country looking to advance this work. And then lastly, and I think this will be my last slide here. If you advance one, John, one back. A couple of final reminders about the critical need to end the reliance on fines and fees. As part of the work to empower and incentivize states that are concerned about the money and want to maximize their federal match, that there are actually better and more stable ways to do this and fund this over the long term. because part of why this is so important, and we face this resistance in Maryland, given the fiscal climate, a lot of time policymakers want to cling on to the existing funding sources. Like, we can't end the reliance on fines and fees because how will we pay for it? And part of what we do in this brief is lift up the case that actually you'll have much more success doing that if you truly invest in this work. And to keep pushing for the change at the federal level, the Office for Victims of Crime is in its final stages of, for the first time in a generation, updating the federal guidance. We were hoping that that would get done during the current presidential administration. It hasn't yet, and we are still hopeful and can keep pushing for that to happen. So thanks so much, and we look forward to having a discussion and getting to some of the questions in the chat.
Thank you both so much. You covered a tremendous amount of ground in not very much time. So we're gonna get a couple questions in here, and I will ask both of you to try to be concise so that we can get to at least a few of these. So one question here at the end that I'm actually going to give to John first and then to you, Heather, because I think it gets to a thread that is, really specific in the crime victim world, but speaks to the CVI world as well. So we have a question here noting that VOCA funding has been dramatically decreasing for victim services, and as a result, there are programs providing direct services that are closing. And so the question is asking, is VOCA funding for crime victim compensation competing with VOCA funding for victim services? And how do we balance that? Both of them are important. And, how do we ensure that public funding is serving both of these related needs, one for direct compensation and one for victim services? So John, I actually wanted to ask you to answer that, as looking back on sort of the history of grant making, as everyone here in the business of doing crime, community violence intervention and prevention work and victim support is thinking about how do we work with our policymakers to resource all of this work, the prevention work, the intervention work, the root cause work. Talk to us about, and we're thinking, do we try to make it as broad as possible? Do we try to braid existing funds? Do we, how do we do this? Can you say a little bit about, broad, anything you can say that, what have we learned? And then I'll ask Heather to say specifically about what's going on with victim services.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I'll be as brief as possible. I do think, when you look at federal funding, you'll see lots of revenue sources that look like, oh, this could fit what I'm doing. And often this is called braiding, or like putting together. I would recommend, and when I was in government, I tried to do this. It's really attractive, especially if you're administering these funds. And it comes from Congress appropriating all different kinds of, or creating all different kinds of programs. If you can do that, if it works, that's awesome. I would be very hesitant to recommend that as a strategy, because I think you'll end up spending a lot of time trying to do it, and it may not work very well. So I think this is very, very state specific, very, very, just very, very state specific. And I think, again, I would go to the victim services as the model. What they did, and it didn't happen overnight, but they created a separate funding stream. And I think from a federal perspective, that's where CVI really needs to go.
So dedicated funding that folks have control over and can be advocates for and can build that political power.
Just to be really clear, I'm not saying don't do braided funding.
Yeah,
I don't want to
right.
it, but I think that's going to be very hard and very frustrating unless you already have it.
Yeah. And then Heather, can you speak a little bit to this tension specifically with respect to VOCA funding?
Definitely. I mean, I think it's very clear there's a crisis and a lot of concern about sustaining levels of VOCA funding throughout the country. But I would say that I don't view that as a tension or a competition between the VOCA victim services and compensation side, because ultimately, the effectiveness of both is inextricably linked, and the victim service providers play such a huge role in sort of liaising access to programs for the actual compensation funds. And states are doing a lot of different and creative things to make sure they try to sustain the funding sources of both. So I think overall, it would be sort of a misconception to think there's like a one-size-fits-all answer or that they are in tension with one another. I want to lift up as a strategy of where I think we should be headed in the longer term, that speaks to both, which is flexible funding. California and some other states are starting to experiment with, outside of the realm of the federal victim compensation program, supplementing that with the ability, and often doing it through community-based victim service providers that might otherwise be seeking VOCA grants, to get cash assistance or other tangible resources in the immediate aftermath of violence to victims who may otherwise be ineligible for the federally funded program, or who may have needs that don't fit that state's criteria. And I think this is a really important, promising direction that everyone should try to head.
We have a couple of questions here related to how, what you all can say about how to navigate the restrictions and challenges inherent both to CVI the available funding for CVI and the available funding for crime victims compensation. Some folks here have cited deadlines attached to obligating and spending funds. I think that was respect to the CVI funding. Other folks here are citing collaboration requirements with local law enforcement, or the fact that folks are, might be both perpetrators of violence and victims and survivors of violence. Can you both say a little bit about, and Heather, maybe this is for you because you have your sort of policymaker engagement and advocacy hat on here. What's possible? Can you say a little bit about what's been possible recently in sort of cataloging those challenges around grant streams, and then actually working with policymakers and administrators to make those fixes? Because I think that's an area where there's more maturity with respect to VOCA. I mean, those of us engaging with CVI funding, this funding's only been around for a couple of years. VOCA has been around for longer. What should folks who are looking at the ARPA funds or the CVI funds saying, holy cow, these are really hard to access. They're not available for everybody. They don't fit our programs. We would need these to look really different to really be able to use them. Can you just reflect a little bit on how the VOCA funds have sort of navigated those challenges and inspire us a little bit, if you can, with where there have been some recent successes?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd love to provide some inspiration by drawing on this recent transformative law change in Maryland that tried to head on address some of those exact problems that you articulated. One of them being ending the reliance on a police report to get access to these benefits, which for so many reasons, some of which I covered, meant that this was completely inaccessible or unworkable for many victims and for many service providers who are working with marginalized survivors who, for many good reasons, didn't want to have anything to do with interfacing with that part of the process. So creating alternate sources of documentation to be able to remove the program or sort of untether it from the criminal justice system. It's still very collaborative with the criminal justice system, but not only to make it more accessible and then increase that amount of federal reimbursement, but also diversify the partnerships of who this program is really carried out by and meant to serve. And some other states are starting to do this. I think one of the biggest sea changes of all of what we were able to do to address those problems is strike from state statute the ability of the state to determine the so-called worthiness of a crime victim by ending the ability to decide whether they could be denied benefits because they contributed to their own victimization. So speaking to that part of the question about sort of the false binary between victims and perpetrators, the discriminatory ways that the victim blaming happened, like basically we're done with that. We're going to use this program to get people the help that they need because we know that that actually works. It is a stabilizing factor that helps to improve our violence reduction efforts. And the last thing I want to lift up in response to that question, a groundbreaking report just came out of the United States Civil Rights Commission speaking to federal efforts in examining racial and ethnic disparities among victims of violence. It catalogs a lot of the research behind this, a lot of the barriers to federal programs, given the racial equity concerns around these issues. And I hope that this is an incredible advocacy tool and an incredible tool to help convince state policymakers that there is a better, more effective approach to administering these programs.
Thank you so much. I regret terribly that we are just about at time. I hope that folks listening feel as inspired as I do about the potential here to leverage lessons hard learned in adjacent parts of the violence prevention and public safety work as we think about how to sustain really not just sustain funding, but really usable funding for community violence intervention strategies into the next administration and at the state and local level. And I think there's a lot to be excited about and also clearly a lot of work to do. And there were a lot of state-specific questions in the chat and some technical questions as well. So I want to just flag for folks. John and Heather may regret this, but they both put their email on the last page of the deck. We will be sending that out to everyone who registered along with their research briefs and the full slide deck. So you will get that. And I encourage you all to be in touch with them directly about some of those nuances and thoughts that you all have. And let's keep this conversation going. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And John, Heather, we're so grateful for your time. This webinar will be available on the Joyce Foundation website in the coming days. And in addition, we are excited to launch a new webinar series starting next month, in addition to this monthly Lunch and Learn series. Our new series will focus on firearms research commissioned by the CDC. In 2019, Congress has resumed funding firearms research through the CDC, and now the first funded projects are starting to produce new and important findings for the field. So the first of those webinars in the new CDC Focus series will explore the impact of firearms violence on youth. That's going to be on Tuesday, November 12th from 11 a.m. to noon Central, including researchers from the University of California, Davis and Northwestern University. So please keep an eye on your mailing list for the registration link to that. And we hope you'll join us for that and other future webinars. So thank you again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.